Great. So we are now live. Good evening, everyone, and welcome to Karwan. This is Ishan Sharma, and today with me I have a very special guest, somebody who is an inspiration to me and to many history students, Professor Partha Mitter. And today, Professor Mitter is going to speak about art and nationalism in colonial India. Before going into the session, before introducing our speaker today, I wish to remember somebody whom we have lost this morning, Professor Frederick Rick Asher. Professor Asher was a specialist in South Asian art. His scholarly interests examined the visual culture of Indian Ocean trade from the South China Sea to the Swahili coast prior to 1500. Each of his three most recent books focused on Buddhist sites in India: Bodh Gaya in 2008, Nalanda in 2015, and most recently Sarnath last year in 2020. Throughout his professional journey, he took interest in contested religious space, issues related to art as commodity, particularly looking at patterns of trade as they relate to works of art in India and the historiography of Indian art. It is a colossal loss to the world of academia. May Professor Asher's soul rest in peace. Amen. And our deepest condolences to Professor Catherine B. Asher. Moving ahead with today's session, we have with us Professor Mitter. Professor Partha Mitter is a writer and historian of art and culture, specializing in the reception of Indian art in the West, as well as in modernity, art, and identity in India, and more recently also in global modernism. He studied history at University of London and did his doctorate with E.H. Gombrich in 1970. He began his career as junior research fellow at Churchill College, Cambridge in 1968 to 69, and he was the research fellow at Clare Hall, Cambridge from 70 to 74. In 1974, he joined University of Sussex as a lecturer in Indian history, retiring in 2002 as professor in art history. His publications include Much Maligned Monsters: History of European Reactions to Indian Art, published by Clarendon Press, Oxford in 1977, reprinted in India by Oxford University Press in 2013. Art and Nationalism in Colonial India, 1850 to 1922, Occidental Orientations, published in 1994 by Cambridge University Press. Indian Art, Oxford Art History Series, University of Oxford Press, Oxford in 2002. The Triumph of Modernism, India's Artists and the Avant-Garde in 1922-1947, which came out in 2007. In 2000, he was invited by the Indian government to set up the School of Art and Aesthetics at Jawaharlal Nehru University in New Delhi. He is currently serving as the Professor Emerita of Art History at the University of Sussex. So without further ado, I formally invite and welcome the legend himself, Professor Partha Mitter. Over to you, sir, and thank you so much for accepting our invitation.
Thank you, Ishan. It's a real pleasure, and thank you for inviting me. I feel deeply honored. First of all, I want to think about my old friend, Rick Asher, and of course, I'm thinking of Kathy Asher. I've known for many, many years. It is a sad day, so I just wanted to express my deep sadness. Now, I'm going to talk about, first of all, during the colonial period, during British rule, introduction of what one calls naturalist art, art that looks real, Western art, but also our struggle with, the colonial rule, and art becomes part of our identity. So that's what the talk is about. Now, we usually think of modern art as Cubism and other products of Western avant-garde. And of course, revolutionary modernism affected art all over the world. India was no exception. And of course, it started in India with Gagananda Tagore from 1920s onwards, and with great, progressive artists of Bombay, Hussain Souza, Raza, and on to today, this tremendous, vibrant interest in contemporary art and modernism in India. So that, of course, we're very involved with. But I'm going to talk about a slightly different issue, a wider definition of modern art in India. I view it as a part of global modernity, the great changes. And as modernity affected national self-definition in all over the world, wherever Europe expanded. Let me take the first two, just to give you you all know it, but sometimes it's necessary to give just a list of main figures I'm going to talk about. Okay. Now, of course, on our left is Ravi Verma. On the right is Usman Hamdi Bey, and I'm coming to the reason why I show him. In the 19th century, Usman Hamdi Bey in the Ottoman Empire, which became Turkey, he was in many ways similar to Raja Ravi Verma. His approach, his lifestyle, and Ravi Verma was the greatest academic painter in India. Both of them deployed the language of European Orientalist art to create a very specific Ottoman or Indian sense of the East. One aspect of modernity I will speak of is the great information revolution associated with the global colonial order that created wide communication network, railways, telegraph, and above all, not always realized, print technology, printing press. So the introduction of Western art throughout the non-Western world was part of the process of global modernity. So I begin with the artistic revolution in India as an integral part of British rule. Now, by the middle of the 19th century, Indian taste had turned thoroughly Victorian. Marble Palace in Calcutta, quite a well-known building. Not only that, it has a wonderful museum and one of the examples of art from there. Very Victorian, very 19th century European collection. So the taste had become very Victorian, very European by mid-19th century. But at the same time, the British Raj, East India Company, in the 1850s, decided to embark on a systematic project of English education for the Indian elite. They also aimed at improving Indian taste by introducing Victorian art. Just to give you an example here, on your right is a wonderful painting from Mancourt. It's at the Victoria and Albert Museum in London. It's an amazing, brilliant array of colors and clean, pure lines. And here you have Sir Edwin Poynter's visit to Asclepius. But for the British, of course, on the left was the superior form of painting. We should think about that. Now, the new revolution in art in India, excuse me, transformed art practices, art institutions, genres of art, and artistic outlook. It gave rise to a generation of what I call gentleman artists. They were no longer tied to aristocratic patronage, but began to depend on for their validation on a very art-savvy public. I would describe this embrace of Victorian art by Indians as a case of what the Marxist thinker Antonio Gramsci has called consented coercion of the underclass by the rulers, the other, like India, like the colonized elite. But I would also add that the adaptation of the syntax of Victorian art was not a simple imposition of Western art on Indian artists, but involved artistic agency, freedom to choose. Secondly, within a few years, such optimism about the success of academic art, that's what you see here, Edwin Poynter, founded on the rock, he hit the rock of emerging nationalism. So what happened was nationalist artists complemented the struggle on political, economic, and social fronts with their own contribution to culture and nationalism. So what I try and show you tonight is the underlying tensions between Western art practices in India and its resistance by the cultural nationalists. Now, interestingly, on 19th of July, 1850, the East India Company announced grandly that art schools would confer material and moral benefits of practical knowledge to Indians. But interestingly, embarrassingly, the Great Exhibition in London, 1851, showed a very strange paradox. While the manufacturers of advanced European nations, like Britain, showed a serious decline in taste, the decorative arts of India displayed a perfect sense of design. You see here on the left, a page from the Art Journal catalogue of 1851, which shows that the objects shown at the exhibition, Indian objects, the beautiful ones, they were much praised for their perfect sense of design. There were these radical designers, I call them, Owen Jones, Henry Cole, William Morris. They held the British Raj, responsible for letting such a fine tradition die out. So it's a complex problem why there was decline in Indian handicrafts. But stung by their criticism, the government decided to found art schools in Calcutta, Bombay, and Madras, old names those days, Kolkata, Mumbai, and of course, Chennai, modeled on the School of Industrial Arts at South Kensington in London to train artisans. So you see on the right an example of a drawing by English art student to inspire Indian artisans. But government policy was a failure because they had contradictory aims. And first of all, artisans were poor, couldn't afford the fees. I mean, why impose fee however small it was? So what happened was their places were quickly filled by boys from the families who were already benefiting from English education. And they loved academic art. I've written about it in detail in my book. The English art teachers who came to these art schools brought with them prized drawings of English art students, as you see an example here, laying the foundation of academic art. And what happens? Two most popular subjects are portraits, landscapes of the kind you see in Europe, both new to India. Two typical examples. On the left, a very important exponent of portrait painting in Bombay, Pestonji Bomanji. His little Parsi girl showed in one of the Bombay Art Society exhibitions, and also shown same society, the Bengali painter J.P. Ganguly's Sunset over the river Ganges. So these were the most lucrative professions, but neither portraits nor landscapes could compete with what I call history painting, seen as the pinnacle of Victorian art. But I also want to mention here another innovation, of course, didn't depend on the colonial regime. The phenomenon of the printed image. This was the process of mechanical reproduction and had revolutionary impact on artistic production, and also importantly, formation of national identity in India. Print culture certainly provided the impetus for India-wide nationalism by contributing to what Benedict Anderson has called imaginary community that transcended regional differences. But what I tried to show wasn't just the printed text. Visual images were also important in forging this common culture, a visually imagined community that shared it easily understood, non-textual language, reaffirming common values and aspirations. But Indian artisans were very, very quick to learn the market potentials of print technology. Pune Chitrashala Press, very, very well known, dominated the market. So what you have is, in this age of mechanical reproduction, is the tremendous multiplication of popular prints, a colonial urban art form. Now, there are two kinds. One is a more elite one in magazines, journals, and books. So there you have cartoons, which became a staple feature of print culture. Let me show you the next set, and I'll explain in a minute. By the 1870s, the English comic magazine Punch had become a transcultural phenomenon. This was amazing. Typical productions came out of Cairo, Istanbul, Shanghai, and Tokyo. Through clever marketing and as well as brilliant cartoonists, Punch became a household word. But it also shows how a concept of technology originating in one culture undergoes transformations of meaning and inflection when it's introduced in a different culture. And it is a global phenomenon. Surprisingly, comic magazines in India, of course, inspired by, and what I would stress here, conservative journal Punch. Punch was very middle-class conservative, but it became a forum of anti-colonial resistance. On the left, you have an English production in the Charivari, one of the first. Punch-inspired magazine, founded by an Englishman. But this conservative paper mocks Indian nationalists because they were keen on women's emancipation. So they show Hindu god Krishna. It's the personification of education. Seducing women, gopis, you'd say, with the promise of freedom. But there was an explosion of local versions of Punch, much more political and very interesting. But because of diversity of languages, English language, Hindi Punch enjoy the greatest success. Here you see a cover of Hindi Punch. I haven't got time, but just to mention, vernacular punches in Urdu, Bengali, etc., were far more radical and pretty hard-hitting. I can't leave you without showing my favorite, really one of the finest cartoonists in India, Gagananath Tagore. So what you had in around 1917, great flowering of caricature in Gagananath's expressionist cartoons. See, very savage, unsentimental gaze exposes the hypocrisy of westernized social mores. The Brahmin priest here pretends to uphold traditional values while he indulges in alcohol and women in secret. This is on the left here. But on the right, you see the Brahmin priest dispensing blessing, Shanti Jol, to rather unsuspecting women. I want to now turn to Raja Ravi Verma, his painting of women of India, different parts of different provinces of India. His glittering success really demonstrates the striking success of Victorian art in India. His dates, 1848, 1906, much admired by the Indian nobility and the Raj high officials. But what's interesting, cheap prints of his Hindu deities hung in even the humblest of homes. I'm going to show you the example in a minute, but contemporary critics dismiss these prints as bad art, but they are still an essential ingredient of popular culture. But, Verma's spectacular canvases influenced the pioneers of the Indian cinema. So what did he do? He was a little prince. He created the image of the fashionable painter, the traveling professional, very much in the Victorian mold, who fulfilled commissions, constantly on the move, destroying in the process the monopoly of European painters. And it's interesting, even though he had showed the way, no other Indian artist has ever matched his pan-Indian network. There was this story of his self-taught genius, which lay at the heart of his reputation. But far from being an amateur genius, he was in fact very, very clever, intelligent, and he owed his success to a systematic, though private training, first in traditional art by the court painter Ramaswamy Naidu on your left. And then, of course, he learns European art. But on the right is his early painting, very important. It's in the collection of Fateh Singh Museum in Baroda. Here you see Tarabai, one of the princesses. But when you notice, it's in a flat style, lot of gold. It also owes a little bit to photography, but this is actually very interesting that it really harks back more to Ramaswamy Naidu to any European painter, although it's in oils. One thing I also want to mention to you, and I want you to think about it. it's colonial world all over the globe. But I would say also the modern world, printed reproductions, printed, paintings and their circulation. It is a colonial phenomenon, but it had wider reach. So what's interesting is the main artistic source for Verma wasn't an original European painting, but it's black and white or color reproduction. Of course, it's understandable. In the late 19th, early 20th century, Indian artists didn't have the opportunity to travel to Europe to experience academic art directly. Kalapani was a very important obstacle. But even when original, original works were available to colonial artists, they preferred to, let me go to the next painting in a minute. They preferred to use reproductions, as we shall see. For his complex paintings, Verma obtained German prints and art books, including studies of the academic nude. So his knowledge of anatomy was based on such works. In fact, the story in his brother's autobiography, they couldn't persuade any female to pose for them. During the years 1880, 81, Verma evolved into a full-fledged academic painter when he was working at the princely court of Baroda. I give you two examples. One is the earlier one, and the next one is Chimnamai. Excuse me, I have this sort of terrible throat. Chimnamai, one of the young brides in Baroda, they're wonderful painting, a great national treasures. But here you see the transformation of style within a short period. Princess Tarabai, earlier painting, is closer to tinted photographs, flat painting. But by the time you have Maharali Chimnabai, he had mastered its craft, technical virtuosity, with a sensitive portrayal of the vulnerable young bride when you see the modeling of her face. But the pinnacle of technical assurance culminated, and here you see the technical skills, the brocade sari, the silk, the velvet, all the different things. But it culminated in one of the finest portraits at the National Gallery of Modern Art in Delhi. I hope you've seen it, 1893. This noble work blends the distant worlds of Indian and European art, its ivory-like treatment of the subject, with a deep feeling for naturalism. And I'm reminded of the great French painter Ingres here. Now, Verma's lifestyle was as novel as his painting style. His professionalism was new in India, the artist as an entrepreneur. He became celebrated as a portrait painter, the most competitive genre in this period. But he may not have even considered painting as a career, because you can imagine, even in the colonial period, artists were treated as low craftsmen. The nobility never painted for their livelihood. They were amateurs. However, his ambitions were held by the modernizing ruler of Travancore. Verma established himself as a society portrait painter, and here comes now his younger brother, Ravi Verma. Ravi Verma, who joined him in the 1880s. Interestingly, Raja Verma was the first modern Indian artist to maintain a diary. The second one was by Venkatappa. Now, it's a valuable source of Verma's professional life. They organized portraits with business-like efficiency. The painting methods were different from traditional practices, securing commissions, sometimes through agents, initial sittings, taking photographs of the sitter, the subject, followed by painting the face, often done by Ravi Verma, while the younger brother Raja concentrated on background and details, much again in the manner of Victorian painters. They efficiently divided their work into two kinds: portrait commissions with tight deadlines and more leisurely production of art for art exhibitions around the country. They often did 2 or 3 paintings at once. The studio, if you see the photograph, a Victorian painter, like a Victorian painter, 3 or 4 paintings at different stages of completion. So by 1890s, Ravi Verma had emerged as the most important Indian painter. You'd certainly have been remembered as the leading portrait painter of the aristocracy. But it was his history painting that established his universal popularity. Now, of all forms of narrative art, none was most admired in the 19th century than history painting, which was seen to promote public interest. While the English rulers were keen to introduce history painting for the moral, what they call moral upliftment of their subjects, it was also a logical choice for Indian nationalists. Because 19th century, all the nations who were struggling with the nationalism, history painting became their mode of expression. Verma was the first painter to evolve a new language of narrative art, what I call sending the imagination back to antiquity. He was raised in Victorian academic art, as learned from the productions, but he deployed it for his what he called authentic recreations of the Hindu past. He drew copiously on ancient Indian classics, and he knew Sanskrit, but using them, he carefully selected only the stories that plucked the beholder's heartstrings. Victorian sentimentality went hand in hand with a new image of voluptuous women. You see here, it's a blend of Kerala and Guccino, the Italian painter. On the left is the Distrobimo Indrani by Indrajit. And on the right, you have Ravana cutting off Jatayu's wings. Verma's first narrative circle was commissioned by the ruler of Baroda during the rising tide of nationalist passion. India was changing rapidly. Railways, telegraphs, and printing technology brought regions together as never before. Journalism helped spread Verma's reputation. The brothers traveled by rail all over India. But with this commission, I have to mention, these two are from Mysore. I don't show you any actual history painting from Baroda. These were from the Jayachamarajan Gallery in Mysore, but it's the same thing. Verma became a pan-Indian nationalist. The Indian intelligentsia acknowledged his value to national unity. So the Baroda epics blended melodrama with ethics in the manner of European history painters. Also, you see here. But as you see in Triumph of Indrajit, from the epic Ramayana, is a mixture of indigenous and Western elements. Verma, of course, chose the syntax of the Europeans' salon art, but the gloss he put on it was recognizably Indian. You see, this pictorial language gave him the power to represent the Indian princely courts as he knew it. You know, Trivandrum, Baroda, and so on. Past history imagined as present melodrama. The gods here you see, like this one, if you can see at the back in the background, is certainly inspired by European Orientalist painter. But he also transferred sometimes, like Indrajit, sex and sadism of these Orientalist painters. End of the century, Verma becomes a cult figure among the educated, but he still wasn't satisfied. Unlike other court artists, Verma was ambitious, wanted to gain his independence. Princely courts offered him financial stability, but newspapers made him, or magazines made him famous. But he also understood that printed images were very important. And, you know, I mentioned Pune Chitrashala Press. German presses were flooding the market with lots of different material, including pornography. Verma brothers decided to challenge their monopoly. They set up the Ravi Verma Fine Art Lithographic Press. Yes, yes. So they wanted to, as they said, improve Indian taste by injecting the idealism they felt lacking in bazaar works. The paintings eventually became synonymous with cheap prints of India. I mean, no other prints are as famous as the Verma brothers' prints. But he understood the underlying principles of naturalism. He fused European and Indian elements. And that was a great, you know, improvement. And actually his prints were very, very much higher quality oleographs. But as his prints spread all over India, they didn't benefit financially at all. The business venture was a failure. That's because, you know, it's very easy to copy any print. So that kind of endless pirating of their works destroyed their, well, profit as well as, in some ways, their reputation. So nonetheless, Verma, this print on the left from Baroda, painting based on Verma's painting, and it's Vishwamitra and Menoka with baby Shakuntala. But then it's used cleverly by an American firm that produces baby food. And while poor Vishwamitra's regretting his moment of indiscretion, this Mellon's baby food people say the baby food is good for the baby. So that's very interesting use of his prints. Now, so in 1906, Verma dies, and he's known in India, all over India, as a national hero. Sorry, I keep pressing the div. Yeah, national hero. But within a year of his death, he was knocked off his pedestal and his reputation was absolutely gone. His works were rejected by the new generation of nationalists for being artificial, unspiritual, a hybrid product. Why did he lose so quickly? This is because the turn of the 20th century, there was this, what I call the great wave of cultural nationalism. That led to resistance to Western academic art. You also find allies of Indian nationalists in Europe. Victorian critics really excoriated, they criticized Victorian industrial society everywhere. The theosophists saw India's spirituality as the only alternative to Western progress. So by the 19th century, a romantic image of India was created by the Orientalists who translated Sanskrit classics. So Indians who had become unsure about their own position in the world began to gain their confidence. 1893 is a very important date. The charismatic Hindu monk, Swami Vivekananda, was in Chicago, won rapturous ovation at the World Congress of Religion, Chicago. But the actual inspiration was by an English teacher called Ernst Binfield Havel. He was an anti-classicist, anti-academic artist in England who preferred medieval art to Renaissance naturalism. Havel was convinced that India's spirituality was reflected in her art because Indian art was not tainted by Renaissance. But I want to explain to you what spirituality means here. Which may explain why Verma fell from grace. British rulers who wanted to introduce academic art in India were admirers of Victorian history painting. Of course, as you know, on the right, you see here. They talked to Indian miniatures. They felt, yes, they're elegant, but they were ultimately highest form of decoration. They simply lacked the higher intellectual content that was found in what they said, history painting, as we see here. But I want you to bear in mind one thing. Decorative art doesn't mean ornamentation of objects, not simply handicrafts. The essential contrast is here, as you see here, Raja Mankot, the flat treatment of shapes and colors in Indian miniatures. And you see three-dimensional Western illusionist painting. The British saw the inferiority of Indian art in this decorative quality. So the nationalists asserted and reasserted and constructed their own response. The very decorative quality of Indian art was a sign of its spirituality. This is the time when the kind of exclusive view of modern Hindu identity was being constructed, literature, projecting a unity based on the myth of common descent. In art, this was seen as a form of cultural authenticity, the pure essence of traditional Hindu art, as opposed to the hybrid art of colonial India, epitomized by poor Ravi Verma. But of course, it's a myth. And what is authentic? I mean, there is really no such thing as authenticity. It depends on interpretation. So the Bengal school of painting, the first nationalist art movement, arose against its background. Let's look at it. I want to first explain this by what the Bengal school was trying to do by taking, sorry, I keep on pressing, yeah, by taking two examples of nationalist art. On your left, you have Mexico, the painter Rivera doing a large mural in Mexico. Mexico was colonized by the Spaniards and Austrian and underwent a period of national resistance. Rivera and other muralists celebrated the Mexican Revolution with ambitious murals glorifying pre-Columbian original Aztecs. But I want to point to you out to you that the narrative structure was, of course, indigenous, going back to Indian roots, as you know, American roots. The visual language remained wholly within the naturalist Renaissance academic idiom. On the other hand, if you look at the right, an example of Abhinav's painting, early painting, Indian artists' resistance to the West meant creation of indigenous style of visual language that challenged urban industrial culture of colonialism. So they now flaunted the flat style of Indian miniatures that had been branded by Victorians as decorative art in preference to the three-dimensional Western style. So in 1896, E.B. Havell at Calcutta Art School put forward plans for reforming teaching. He urged young Indians to return to their own heritage. He replaced European art collection with Mughal paintings. There was a beautiful Mansoor in Calcutta. He also took the radical step of introducing Indian mode of teaching. But by this time, Western tastes had become so ingrained and there was uproar in the city. We think that Havell is destroying our tradition. At this critical juncture, Havell met the young artist, Abanindranath Tagore. Abanindranath was, member of the famous Tagore family, Rabindranath Tagore. Abanindranath received liberal education at home, and he was allowed to develop his creative personality. He took some lessons in European art, but he found it quite alien to his temperament. So in search of a suitable style, he turned to Indian miniatures. Illustrating the mystical text, Gita Govinda by Jayadeva, Radha and Krishna on the left. That's what he painted, one of the earliest. But his canon of beauty is emaciated human form. The local intelligentsia nationalists, used to the more opulent figures of Ravi Verma's Radhas, were outraged. I just want to show you Abhinav's own work by comparing with a late medieval painting from Deccan. Again, a scene of spring, and the heroine is thinking of love, and all the sort of atmosphere, all the accoutrements of spring. Sorry, I keep doing this, sorry. With the cranes, the flowers, so Havell met, of course, Abhinavnath and began to implement his reforms at the art school. So Abhinav was put in charge of what he called recovering the lost language of Indian art. But already in 1903, he had produced on the left the last moments of Shah Jahan, the builder of Taj Mahal. And this was a turning point, the creation of nationalist art. Now, here I contrast with a page from Akbarnama at the Victorian Albert Museum the Emperor Akbar supervising the building of Fatehpur Sikri. As you look at Abhinavnath, the treatment is self-consciously Mughal, flat, unshaded treatment of figures and background. But his main interest is Taj Mahal Pietra Dura, the marble work. But he also retains some amount of European perspective, but his spirit is much closer to Victorian art, stressing mood, feeling, and sentiment. He calls it bhava. He wants to infuse the work with pathos and melancholy. So he found Mughal colors rather unsatisfactory, and especially when they're rendered in oils. So his quest for a more appropriate style led him to Japanese painting. How so? The year 1900 is very important. High tide of Pan-Asian solidarity and watershed in the Japanese relationship. Rabindranath Tagore, the Japanese Okakura Kakuzo, and others were trying to create a kind of regional form of modernism that didn't owe to European formalist modernism. So in that quest, Okakura Tenshin arrived from Tokyo to Calcutta to forge a Pan-Asian alliance against the West. He had been responsible for challenging Meiji period Westernization. And so, yes. And he had rejected academic art, tracing the ultimate source of Buddhist art of Japan in ancient Indian frescoes of Ajanta. In Okakura stayed with the Tagores, where he finished his famous work, Ideals of the East. Pan-Asian was seductive, the idea. It responded to Western technology and progress. It was a romantic worldview in search of a disappearing tradition. But of course, it was Europeans who created the myth of one undifferentiated Orient, as you probably all know from Edward Said's work. But it also became a powerful focus of Asian aspirations. Asian societies were seen as spiritual in contrast to the materialist West. This brief alliance created a regional form of West modern avant-garde that countered Western modernist art, as I've talked about it elsewhere. Now, Okakura is a champion of Nihonga, traditional art, as opposed to what's called yoga, Western style in Japan. And he sent two of his finest pupils, Taikan, Yokoyama Taikan, and Hishida Shunsho to Calcutta to work with Abhinavnath. Interestingly, Taikan copied Hindu deities, there are some examples, and experimented with Mughal style. This is his own image of, spring with the moon. And here he's emulating Japanese style. Taikan, on his part, taught Abhinavnath to avoid strong colors, hard outlines, draw each line with great care, with a light touch, importance of gesture, brushstroke. These were, in Japanese art, the Morotai wash technique. So Abhinavnath produced paintings between 1900 and 1910, combining Japanese wash technique with the Mughal arrangement of planes. Here you have very subtle combination of grays, chromatic modulations, and pale shades, kind of conveying a sense of serenity and stillness. It actually reflected Abhinavnath's contemplative temperament, but in keeping with the spirit of Eastern art. Let's now retrace our steps to the progress of nationalist art to complete our story. 1905, Lord Curzon partition in Bengal, first major Swadeshi unrest. Though centering in Bengal, it spread all over India. It had ripples. Lala Lajpat Rai, for instance, and various other great figures, Tilak. It inspired Abhinav to make a rare political statement, and this is Bharat Mata, Mother India. She's not a conventional Hindu goddess, but a chaste middle-class Bengali lady ascetic. 4 objects are not conventional symbols. Not chakra and gada and so on. It's the spiritual knowledge, spiritual knowledge, the Vedas or the texts, secular knowledge, the text manuscript, spiritual knowledge, the rosary, corn as food, a piece of fabric as clothing. These 4 are elements of self-sufficiency, Swadeshi. Economic self-determination. This is the only direct involvement of Rabindranath. But he expressed his opposition to the West as a form of cultural nationalism by this flat, decorative style of painting. It tries to express a pan-Indian synthesis of different Asian art. Let's remember that he didn't call it Indian art, he called it Oriental art. The synthesis of different Asian styles. It ultimately became mostly Japanese. Bengal school painters is, of course, challenge academic painters. And fierce debates arose about what is authentic art. Academic artists felt threatened by this rather exclusive view of art and decided to go for the jugular. In Bengali journals, some of them adopting the British academic painter Joshua Reynolds as their patron saint. But in response to the academic artists, Abhinav insisted that art must be expressed through what he calls the inner eye. He was particularly harsh with his students if they expressed a wish to draw from life. The first victim of the Bengal school was, of course, Ravi Verma's photographic treatment of women as being thoroughly undignified. So soon, Orientalists won their battle at home and abroad, having exhibitions in Paris, London, Berlin, and again London, 1924, Empire exhibition at Wembley. And an English critic was so taken in by this style, he admitted Indian art is mission to the world. Germans always felt close to the Indians because of their defeat in the war, 1914-18. So they were sympathetic to Bengal School of Painting, describing it as a powerful cultural struggle for redemption, end quote. Ironically, Bengal School won the approval of British Raj because they preferred the Swadeshi art to the terrorist bomb. So that the art was better than the Swadeshi bomb. So ultimately, Abhinav's pupils came to dominate the art world everywhere: Lahore, Jaipur, Lucknow, and Madras, to mention only a few. I'm going to show you a few. Hitindranath Majumdar, Hitindranath. Just to give you an example, I find his works very appealing. Self-conscious attempt to merge individual difference in style in trying to create a common vocabulary, though the master, Abhinav, did discourage this. So what do you have? Common features. Linear perspective modified in favor of Mughal perspective, and also sort of Far Eastern atmospheric one. No distant horizon here, but not entirely. There is depth. Colors are governed by monotone conventions, muted. So there's a kind of delicate lyricism here, centering on a new ideal female form. But I find one of the most striking as the South Indian pupil, K. Venkatappa. He produces this amazing surrealist night scene, lit up with glowing diffuse colors. Look at it on the left, still quite Oriental art. But later, when he returned to Bangalore, he distanced himself from the Bengal school, creating remarkable landscapes that had few traces of earlier Oriental art. And I don't want to go on here, but I'm absolutely, totally, seduced by this painting of landscape. So amazingly pure, so clear. And he used to go early in the morning, 3 in the morning, sit there, observe till the sun came up. Wonderful. But I want to finish a couple more things. I'm taking the example on the left is Ashit Haldar and as Shuren Ganguly, both pupils of Abanindranath, and it has a connection with nationalism and history. This image of decay and lassitude, of course, was common with the fin de siècle decadence in Europe. But historicism, nostalgia for a lost civilization, was similar in nationalist art in both the Ottoman Empire and in the Bengal school. So here you see the gloomy nostalgia was bound up with the nation's bondage. The artist sought to express noble sentiments and deep pathos. And here is a historicist painting, Ashit Haldar. You see a prematurely aging man here, bent double with the burden of history, his heritage. The other one is Ganguly's theme of the flight of Lakshman Sen, not of the past glory of the nation, but death, degeneration, and moral panic. Here, the decrepit old king of Bengal abandons his capital in face of the advancing Turco-Afghan forces. This period, a number of nationalists diagnosed their colonial subjugation as going back to earlier period, medieval period. And this is something which became very controversial in Bengal. There were those who, of course, strongly opposed it. I want to end with another expression of nationalism in this period, a very important part. Abdulrahman of Punjab was a very remarkable painter. But here you see nostalgia for degeneration is also evident in him. He represents pan-Islamic nationalism in response to the identification of the Indian subcontinent with the Hindu nation, which is happening increasingly. So he turned to the poems of the great Muslim poet Allama Iqbal, but they didn't happen. You know, of course, Iqbal's Sare Jahan se sabse acha Hindustan hamara. Now, parallel to Verma's use of Hindu epics, Chukta ransacked Muslim classics like the Rubaiyat or Omar Khayyam, but always in this Victorian author Edward Fitzgerald's translation. So his themes belong to the modern colonial nationalist invention of the past. Chukta carried his mannerisms of the Bengal school even further. developing a sinuous line play of lines and colors you see on the right, very striking. Sorry, lines and curves, very kind of reminding us of the English illustrator Aubrey Beardsley, but all of them going ultimately back to the Japanese master Ogata Korin. So these were, in short, the expressions of nationalist art in resistance to British colonial rule, and as gradually identity was being created. Abanindranath expressed his nationalism through a lot of it going back to the Mughal period and drawing upon past glories. Different painters use different aspects of the past. So I'll end here. I think I've taken quite a bit. So thank you very much, all of you. What do I do now? Oh, yes. Yeah, sorry.
Thank you very much, sir. Okay, I think you are able to hear me.
Yes, I'm
great.
back now. Should I? Yeah, lovely.
Yeah.
That's perfect.
Thank you so much, sir, for that amazing session, and I think we truly loved it. And there are so many questions for you in the chat box, and
Shoot away. I'm very happy to do that.
yeah.
I'm sorry, I have to apologize for my throat.
Not at all, sir. Not at all. And we are really thankful to you, even after bad throat and with this new technology, you were able to present this and was with us for this long. And the first question for you is by Somrita Majumdar. Her question is, does the illustrations of Indian constitution represent the tension contest between Western aesthetic practices and indigenous aesthetic principles that influence Bengal school of art?
A very interesting question. But can you explain a little bit what you mean by Indian constitution?
Yeah, I think she meant the painting that are used in the Indian constitution by different painters, or Lal Bose, I think.
I mean, constitution is simply the
Indian,
document. Yeah, but that is not yet in there. It was formulated in the 40s, you see. So, but it does reflect Indian spirit of nationalism, and very much this kind of tension between Western language and transformation and construction of Indian identity.
Great. The next question is by again by Somrita Majumdar. Her question is, could you please throw light on how did the Potuas, the folk artists, face the challenge of production of art in printed format?
Oh, very good question. It's very interesting that, Potuas, particularly Kalighat pot, are very popular. This is the local art form in Calcutta, which emerged with the establishment of Calcutta as a colonial city. Now, what is very striking is that Chitpur becomes the great hub in Calcutta of print technology, lots of print presses, and these entrepreneurs and the enterprising artisans began to develop their devices for illustration. There are lots of woodcuts and then other forms of graphic arts, all the way up to oleographs, lithographs, and so on over the period. What's interesting is the transition that Chitpur artists often took the motifs from Kalighat painting. So that's very interesting interaction. I'm not sure whether Kalighat painters themselves were able to take advantage, because Chitpur artisans already are very skilled. So, but they're using Kalighat motifs and things to develop their own prints. Because Kalighat often had these painters who sat there and did their work. Often they were women.
The next question for you is by Ganesh Shivaswamy. His question is, if Bharat if Bharat stems out from the powerful son of Shakuntala in Dushyanta, why was it effeminized through Bharat Mata? When was Abindranath Tagore's Banga Mata re-christened as Bharat Mata?
Oh, does it mean that Bharat, in a sense, the little Bharat, the original story in the epic, is that what you? The
Yeah,
thing is that, you see, Indian nationalist ideology, nationalist ideas were emerging through literature. I mean, there was literature, a lot of languages, Marathi, South Indian, Hindi. I don't know all of that. I have to confess, it's an ignorance I'm embarrassed by, but one can't learn everything. But if I take the example of Bengal, what happened was, we have to go back to Bankim Chandra Chatterjee's Anandamot. Anandamot, in fact, talks about the Great Mother, Shakti, and she is described in different ways. And the devotees of the goddess, they vow celibacy, and they would never get married. They wouldn't get married until the freed, until they achieved independence. So that's why we begin to find this idea of mother, and it has links with, in Bengal, Kali, Shakti, and Bongamata. There is a lot of link there. But gradually, because Abhinav, I think, was much more a pan-Indian nationalist, as Rabindranath Tagore was. They thought in terms of whole of India. As you know, Rabindranath Tagore, Jana Gana Mana is very much kind of, all India notion. So he deliberately constructed, Bharat Mata, but you see, there are examples, early examples of Nandalal Bose and others of Bangamata.
yes. The next question is by Sumadhura Roy. Her question is, she was wondering about folk paintings about this time, the nationalist time. Do we find similar aesthetics and politics in folk art in the nationalist era, or do we come upon a fresh new politics here?
That's a very, very wonderful question. It's a very important question, and it shows that great change in nationalist thinking. I would ask you to read my Triumph of Modernism, the section on not only Jamini Rai, but the folk art. What happened was, in the late 19th, early 20th century, the Congress Party was entirely run by the elite, very high ranking officials. Its first president was an Englishman, and lawyers, judges, and various other important Indian figures, very much in the city, urban. The great change came with Mahatma Gandhi. He first time showed Indians, the elite Indians, there was such a thing as the village and the people. It's a very important change. And that's changed the focus of politics from city to village. I have to tell you, there are parallels in Mexico and other places. Nationalists gradually moved towards the countryside. And alongside that, several things happened. Kalighat painting in the early 20th century, you might even say early 20th century or late 90s, wasn't a particularly, prized form of art. I mean, not even collected by the wealthy. But there's a new cult, vogue for Kalighat painting. First time discovery of ordinary folk art, popular art within the city, and I call it Bhadralok, but also the elite they discovered Calicut. But on to that, there was a very important nationalist development, which I talk about in Art Nationalism. Nationalists everywhere began to learn about language, the origins of language. When going back to William Jones's showing that Sanskrit, early Iranian and European languages were related by structure, a family of languages. But that led to discovering the roots of language and folk tales. It happened in Germany, Grimm's brothers, Grimm's fairy tales. It happened in Bengal, and I can't tell about other states, but I do hope, younger people will take up this challenge. It's very important to get an India-wide picture, but we are always limited by the languages. So we have Dinesh Sen and various Bengali nationalist writers, scholars. They moved to the village, taking an old-fashioned recording machine, and they began to record all the, folk tales, children's stories, which were eventually collected. Takuma Chuli, grandmother's satchel, or Taguda Chuli, also bag of stories. But this laid the foundation of not only of village thinking, village traditions, and women's traditions. You see, often women are dismissed as old women's tale, but in women were the depository of the wealth of stories in India as elsewhere as well. And that, until now, we have not really appreciated the contribution of women. So this was happening, but they also, alongside that, discovered folk art, art of the village. But there is also a political shift. By the 1920s, particularly because of Mahatma Gandhi, perhaps in some ways, not entirely, in contradictory ways, the earlier nationalist painters, all the way up to Abhinavnath, but Ravi Verma, they thought of whole India, pan-Indian nationalism. In the 20s, regions were coming up as regional nationalism as part of a wider nationalism. And that led to very important things. Guru Shada Datta, who was originally, he was an ISIS, British civil servant, but he did a lot to recover a lot of Bengali folk tales, dances, and he created this whole movement that led to the next stage of the great painter, Jamini Roy, who first started with the city and Calicut. He rejected it to go into village. And he said, I learned from the poet world. That's, the village. That is my inspiration. And that is the great, importance of Jamini Roy. So yes, there is a very interesting change towards region, locality. But this is not just India again. This is also in Germany and lots of other places.
The next question is a long question, and this is by Monica Gogoi. And her question is, she is working on gender, art, and nationalism as part of her master's dissertation. So she wants to know if you can throw a little light on the position of subaltern, and especially subaltern women, as subjects of art during colonial times. As noted by scholars, especially Verma's painting contained mostly upper caste and class women as subjects of art, who became representations of the nation. What may have been the possible reasons for it, and the exclusion of women from other lower communities? Was it to suit the needs of aristocracy?
Thank you. That's a very, very important question. Now, the main thing you must remember, these are not deliberate things. People have consciousness. Ravi Verma was born into a very privileged family. So his experience was limited. He was not trying to, denigrate anything. He believed also, he was very dark. He believed in lighter skin. And as you see in his paintings, Sita is surrounded by, Rakshasas and others. And it is very interesting. It's a kind of really making pointing to the Dravidians and the Sri Lankans and so on. So there is that separation. We are all obsessed with light skin. I don't know why, but this has been, all the ads in papers. Anyway, now, ordinary people did not, for a long time, feature in subalterns in high art, and also women. And this is very interesting. Again, if I may suggest that in my general book, Indian Art, I have actually talked about the other art, subaltern art, women's art, which were not, which were ignored. What happens is that gradually, with a shift in the nationalist thinking along with a region, there's a new awareness of, well, I wouldn't say tribals were initially very important, but Shantiniketan was very important in valorizing the tribes. And it's a form of idealization and a myth-making, but nonetheless, it showed the Santals in a very idealized light. And then you have ordinary people as well, gradually coming into, into art. And this is why, for a long time, subalterns were not very much in the picture. But there's another interesting point here. If you look at artists, and I call them gentlemen artists, very few women, and they were all privileged women, but even then their voice was very muted. But the real change comes with the progressive artists of Bombay. If you look at their background, Hussain, Raza, Ara, you name it, there's so many. There were mixed groups, and some came from very humble background. I think Ara came from a fairly humble background. So that began to happen in the 40s, because otherwise there wasn't that much of consciousness. There was, Marxist movement, communist movement. Yes, that certainly was very important. Chitta Prasad, for instance, does a lot of representation of ordinary people. And if you think of the great Mulk Raj Anand in London, he talked about, ordinary people, comes to India as well. And he was always very keen on the actual salt of the earth. And also there is a certain amount of idealization. You see in Shantiniketan, Ramkinkar didn't belong to the elite, really. And as a great artist, sculptor, he used a lot of his kind of models, Santals. He himself felt, much more bridge between two. But then you have sort of elite sculptors like Devi Prasad Roy Chaudhary, really idealizing the ordinary, the laboring class, the toils. All his later big monumental sculptures about toiling humanity, suffering humanity. So you do have this gradually, so one would call it a much more social consciousness from the 30s, the 40s. And there's an interesting tension between the Congress elite and the Congress ordinary people, and then of course the left-wing parties. And that's not resolved, they're all there.
Yeah, and I think you have answered the next question as well by Shashi Kumar. Were there any artists from the untouchable or lower communities?
Sadly, so-called low community, of course, Ramkinkar Baj. I mean, it is a matter of money as well. And ordinary people, like the Chitpur printmakers, were never given proper, recognition. And neither were the Calicut. This is much later, when there's a sort of form of romanticization, nationalist period. So no, unfortunately, that is one of the problems. And I think it's being redressed. And, which myself, Parul Thabe Mukherjee, Parul and Rakhi Balram, we have edited a very big book, if I may say so here, without advertising, that a lot of deals with recent artistic movement and all the way after independence of bringing in, certainly the non-privileged people, yes. And of course, now, of course, a lot of gender and ethnic and lots of other resistance movements. So this is happening now. But early period, there wasn't a great deal.
So there are lots of questions coming up. So we'll take 5 more questions, seeing the time limit. Uh, and also the wet throat of Professor Mitter, so we won't, really pressurize him in answering all the questions. What we can do is we'll send the remaining questions to Professor
Okay,
Mitter on
I
email.
can give short answers. Yeah, there's no problem.
Yes. So we'll mail all the questions to Professor Mitter. Those the remaining questions after those 5 questions. This question is by Monjima Kar. Her question is, could you please throw light on the drawing of Bharat Mata by Abindranath Tagore, wherein the image of aesthetic is juxtaposed with the inclusion of Shakapola, a bangle worn by married women? How
Yes.
would this reflect the tensions and conciliation of the home and work, or the public and spiritual, with construction of Indian nationalism?
Let me get, yes, okay, I can see it. Yes, which is very interesting. The in a way, I don't know how conscious he was, but he was trying to reconcile the ascetic and the homemaker and the nationalist, of course, discourse of women, the Grihalukhi or Grihalakshmi, and what role do they play in national movement? But this is also a complicated issue, and I don't want to oversimplify it. There have been a lot of writings about it, both from the feminist angle and from other side as well. So yes, I mean, so there are these elements, and it's good to point out. Thank you for pointing out that, yes, that aspect of Bharat Mata.
The next question for you is by Satkirti Sinha, and his question is, was Indian art and artists in fear of upsetting the British definition of morality started drifting away from their own history of obscene arts during the colonial period?
Can I have a little more explanation? Is this obscene art made by Indians during the colonial period, or is it obscene art defined by the British?
I think he wants to ask the history of obscene art during the colonial period made by Indian artists themselves. Do,
Obscene.
yeah, I think.
Okay, very interesting. I mean, I would love to learn more about it. And now, let me explain a couple of things. But I would, are you working on it? Ask Sinab. I mean, is he working on this? I've seen.
Yeah, I think Satkirti says before colonial period. So if you can talk
Yes.
about obscene art before the colonial period.
Yeah, I'll come to that, yes. But please get in touch with me. We can talk more about it, because I'm very particularly interested in this aspect as well. Okay, let me explain. Well, first of all, Hindu religion does not deny sex. As you know, with Tantra, as you know, with the goddesses, they're frank representation of semi-nude. Nothing wrong with that. But we have been so corrupted by Christian faith that we feel, we cringe when we see. I mean, at one time, Indians were found it very embarrassing to even see the goddesses as not wearing clothes, which the missionaries always condemned. Hinduism was seen as immoral. And it took a long time for nationalists to come to terms with this. And interesting enough, actual erotic scenes in Khajuraho, let's say, or Konark. Khajuraho is not so well known, but Konark is very well known. And the Europeans were both intrigued and repelled and scandalized and shocked. And, they talked about Konark, and which really kind of affected Indians, educated Indians. They were embarrassed. And they don't talk about the images at all. If you read Abhinanath's, Bengali writings going to Konark and so on, he talks so beautifully about the whole temple architecture and so on. Not a whisper about the erotic sculpture. I was quite intrigued by that. So what happens? A clash of two morals. Christianity has this strange sense of guilt about sex. So to them, original sin tarnished everything. So it's a very different approach to religion. Hindus always integrated sexuality, mysticism, and faith. And often these were symbolic, and they were very complex systems. I mean, Tantra is very complex, and you can't reduce it to, even the word obscene I wouldn't use, because I think that's a very European word. The thing is that, so what happened in the first phase of westernization, and it's part of enlightenment, and the great figures, everyone, but I can begin with Ram Mohan Roy, a very, very inspiring figure, but he didn't see that as part of, he in a way became more kind of rationalist, puritanical in a European mold, you see. So by the time you have a 19th century Indian middle class, so you see this with slightly with Ravi Verma, because Kerala women didn't wear, had top cover, but they had to, because there's a kind of lot of criticisms and missionaries going around constantly criticizing. So in Bengal, for instance, blouse and other things came into existence, and modesty became a trope, a very new thing. So that's something, there's a clash. So when you think of art, it's a very interesting aspect. European nude was seen as not very, it was fine, because that kind of didn't seem like erotic. It's just kind of, because too far away, too very far removed. But actual Indian figures, and that was much more problematic and not accepted until much later. And so you do find this conflict, and the whole definition of obscene was created also by the British. And they defined it very clearly, what is obscene, what is not. And so all these things had impact as India became modern. I don't agree with it at all. I think it's a way of kind of, we have to think of what we mean by obscene. So, yeah.
Thank you so much, sir, for answering most of the questions. And participants who wish to ask more questions to Professor Mitter can mail to carvanheritage@gmail.com.
Sure.
And we'll forward those mails to Professor Mitter, and he can get back to you on email. And it was truly an honor for me personally, and for Carvan to host you this evening. I think this afternoon for you in the UK, and for delivering such a beautiful lecture on art and nationalism, the connection between it, the tensions that were there, and the relationship. And we hope to host you again very soon for another lecture.
Thank you very much. It's been really, truly a pleasure, because I do feel that when I'm addressing Indian students, the younger generation, it's so important that you all respond to my work. That's the greatest reward for me, So no, I'm very, very happy. And it's great to know you all. Okay.
Thank you very much, sir.
And do thank my friends and those who attended. And
Yes.
Thank you very much, everybody.